At 9:17 in the morning on January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched inside the ruined remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz on Guadalcanal. The bunker had been abandoned days earlier, its roof shattered by artillery and its interior half filled with damp earth and splintered wood. George pressed his body against the inner wall, keeping his silhouette low. From where he sat, the opening of the bunker framed a wide stretch of jungle, broken only by the tall, tangled shapes of banyan trees. George was 27 years old. He had never killed a man in combat. He was not assigned as a sniper. He had no spotter, no radio, no support. The rifle resting against the sandbags was not issued by the United States Army. It was not standard equipment, and it was not approved for frontline use. For 6 weeks, officers in his regiment had openly mocked it. They called it a hunting rifle. They called it a toy. One officer joked that it belonged in a sporting goods catalog, not a war zone. Another referred to it as a mail-order mistake. George ignored them. Now the rifle was aimed at a banyan tree 240 yards away. The tree towered nearly 90 feet above the jungle floor. Its trunk was so wide that 3 men standing shoulder to shoulder could not have wrapped their arms around it. Thick branches radiated outward, intertwining with neighboring trees and forming a canopy that swallowed light and shadow alike. Somewhere inside that canopy, Japanese snipers had been killing American soldiers. 14 men had died in the previous 72 hours. More than had died from malaria in the same span of time. The jungle around Point Cruz was alive with sound, but it was never silent. Birds called from unseen perches. Insects buzzed in constant, uneven rhythms. Far to the east, artillery rolled like distant thunder. None of it mattered. George was not listening. He was watching. Long before the war, before Guadalcanal, before the army, George had learned that sound was unreliable. The human ear could be fooled by distance, echo, and terrain. The eye, trained properly, was harder to deceive. Movement betrayed men more reliably than noise ever could. He scanned the banyan slowly, methodically, starting at the highest visible branches and working downward, left to right, top to bottom. He did not rush. Rushing introduced mistakes. Minutes passed. Then, at exactly 9:17, something shifted. There was no wind. The movement was small, almost insignificant. A slight displacement of leaves where none should have occurred. George adjusted the scope and focused. 87 feet above the ground, a shape began to resolve itself. At first, it was nothing more than darkness against darkness. Then edges appeared. Lines. A human outline. A man crouched in the fork, where 3 massive branches met. The Japanese sniper was facing east, his attention fixed on the narrow supply trail American soldiers used to move food, ammunition, and water forward. He was patient. He was still. He believed himself unseen. George adjusted 2 clicks for wind. He exhaled slowly, letting the breath leave his body without tension. His finger rested on the trigger, taking up slack until only pressure remained. He squeezed. The Winchester fired with a sharp, clean crack that cut through the jungle noise. 240 yards away, the sniper's body snapped backward. For a brief moment, it seemed to hang in the branches. Then gravity took over. The body fell through leaves and vines, tumbling nearly 90 feet before striking the jungle floor with a dull, final sound. George worked the bolt. The spent cartridge ejected smoothly. Another round slid into the chamber. He did not move. Japanese snipers did not work alone. 6 weeks earlier, no one believed this rifle would ever be fired in combat. When George unpacked the Winchester Model 70 at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer examined it with open skepticism. He asked whether George intended to hunt deer or Germans with it. George answered calmly that it was for the Japanese. The rifle had not arrived before George's unit shipped out. While other men cleaned their issued M1 Garands aboard ship, George's rifle sat in a warehouse in Illinois, wrapped in paper and coated in Cosmoline. George had paid for it with 2 years of National Guard wages. It was a civilian rifle, bolt action, 5-round magazine, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope that offered modest magnification but exceptional clarity. The Garand issued to every other man in the battalion weighed less. It fired faster. It held more rounds. But the Winchester required discipline. Captain Morris ordered George to leave the sporting rifle behind and carry a real weapon. George carried the Winchester anyway. By late December 1942, the Marines had been fighting on Guadalcanal for months. They had taken Henderson Field and held it under constant pressure. But they had not cleared Mount Austin, and they had not eliminated Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. The area near Point Cruz was different from the rest of the island. There were no bunkers or trenches, only trees. Massive banyan trees with branches thick enough to support a man's weight. Japanese snipers climbed those trees before dawn and stayed there all day. Invisible, patient. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, 2 men from L Company were shot during a patrol. On January 21st, 3 more died. One was shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had already passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The snipers were killing his men faster than disease. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if the mail-order rifle could do what George claimed. George explained his background. Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards, 6-inch groups at 600 yards, 4-inch groups at 300. The commander gave him until morning. Back in the bunker, George waited. At 9:43, movement appeared again. A different tree, 60 yards north, lower, approximately 50 feet above the ground. The sniper was descending the trunk, relocating after the first shot. George tracked the movement, led slightly, and fired. The second sniper fell backward, his rifle clattering through branches as he dropped. 2 shots, 2 kills. George reloaded using a stripper clip. His hands were steady, his breathing unchanged. This was no different from competition shooting, except the targets were alive. At 11:21, a bullet struck the sandbag 6 inches from George's head. Dirt sprayed across his face. The shot came from the southwest. George pressed himself against the bunker wall and waited. 3 minutes passed. He eased back into position and scanned again. The sniper had fired and relocated, but relocation options in the dense jungle were limited. At 11:38, George found him, 73 feet up, 3rd tree from the left. The sniper had shifted branches but remained in the same tree. It was a mistake. George fired. The 3rd sniper fell without a sound. By noon, 5 Japanese snipers were dead. Word spread through the battalion. Men who had mocked the rifle asked if they could watch. George refused. Spectators drew attention. Attention drew fire. If you want to understand how a single rifle and a single disciplined shooter changed the balance of this fight. This channel focuses on preserving stories like this exactly as they happened. By afternoon, the jungle went still. The remaining snipers adapted. They stopped moving during daylight. At 1600 hours, George returned to battalion headquarters. Captain Morris was waiting. The laughter was gone from his voice. He ordered George back to the grove at dawn. The most dangerous phase of the hunt had not yet begun. The rain began before dawn on January 23, 1943. It started as a thin, steady drizzle that barely disturbed the surface of the jungle floor. Within minutes, it became heavier, soaking leaves, darkening tree bark, and turning the ground into thick mud. Visibility dropped rapidly. At 100 yards, shapes blurred. At 200, they disappeared entirely. George waited. He sat inside the same ruined bunker, rifle across his knees, listening to rain strike the broken roof and run down the walls in thin streams. Water pooled at the lowest points of the bunker floor. The smell of wet earth filled the air. The rain was not a problem. It was an opportunity. Japanese snipers relied on silence and concealment. Rain masked sound. It allowed movement without detection. Men could climb trees unseen, shift positions, and relocate without exposing themselves. George understood this. He also understood that the snipers would not abandon their work simply because 5 of their number were dead. They would adapt. At 08:15, the rain slowed. By 08:45, it had stopped entirely. Steam rose from the jungle floor as the sun pushed through broken clouds. Visibility returned slowly, unevenly, as water continued to drip from leaves and branches. George brought the rifle up and began scanning. The jungle looked unchanged, but it was not. At 09:12, he found the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. It was a smart decision. The sound of rainfall masked movement, and the wet branches left no dry debris to fall and give away his position. The sniper was positioned in a banyan tree nearly 290 yards away, farther than any target George had engaged the previous day. Distance was deliberate. They were learning. George compensated for range, adjusted his aim, and fired. The sniper fell. 6 confirmed kills. This time, the response was immediate. At 09:57, Japanese mortars began impacting the area around the bunker. The first rounds landed 40 yards short. The second landed 20 yards short. The third salvo would hit the bunker directly. George did not hesitate. He grabbed his rifle, ammunition, and canteen and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line, boots slipping in mud, branches tearing at his uniform. He dove into a shell crater just as the third salvo struck. The bunker disappeared in a blast of dirt, splintered wood, and smoke. George lay still, chest pressed into wet earth, listening. The mortars stopped. They had lost him. But they had learned something important. They knew he was alone, and they knew where he had been. George relocated. He chose a fallen tree roughly 120 yards north of the destroyed bunker. The trunk provided cover and a clear field of view into the groves. He settled in and resumed scanning. By mid-afternoon, the Japanese sent more snipers. They were no longer reacting blindly. They were hunting him. At 14:23, George killed the 7th sniper. At 15:41, he killed the 8th. This one had climbed higher than the others, nearly 94 feet up a banyan tree. The position offered excellent concealment. but the height created a silhouette against the sky when the sun shifted angle late in the afternoon. A small mistake. George exploited it. By 17 UI hours, Captain Morris sent a runner. George had been in position for 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George reported 8 confirmed kills over 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris ordered him back at dawn. That night, George cleaned the Winchester in his tent, running oiled patches through the barrel until they came out clean. He checked the scope mounts. He counted his ammunition. There had been 11 Japanese snipers operating in the Point Cruise groves. 8 were dead. 3 remained. Those 3 would be the best. They had survived. They had watched. They had learned. They knew George's rifle. They knew his tactics, and they were now actively planning to kill him. George slept poorly. At 3:04, he gave up and sat awake with the rifle across his lap. The rain returned at 4:15, heavier than before. By 5:30, visibility was so poor that dawn operations would be delayed. George used the time. He moved, not back to the bunker, not to the fallen tree. Somewhere the Japanese would not expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks 70 yards south of his previous position. The Marines had once used the spot as a machine gun nest. It offered solid cover and overlapping fields of fire into the groves. George settled in and waited. At 07:43, the rain slowed to a drizzle. At 08:17, he found sniper number 9. The Japanese soldier was positioned in a palm tree 190 yards away. Low, only 40 feet above the ground. An unusual choice. Most snipers favored height. This one favored concealment. The palm fronds created a natural height invisible from ground level. But George was not at ground level. From the elevated rocks, he could see into the fronds. He raised the rifle and began to squeeze the trigger. Then he stopped. Something was wrong. The position was too easy, too exposed. After 3 days of hunting, the remaining snipers would not make elementary mistakes, unless it was bait. George lowered the rifle and began scanning the surrounding trees. If the sniper in the palm was bait, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for muzzle flash, waiting for movement. George searched methodically. It took 11 minutes. At 08:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up, perfectly concealed by branches and vines. The sniper had a clear line of sight to George's previous position at the fallen tree. He was watching the wrong place. George made a decision. He aimed at the decoy sniper in the palm tree and fired. The decoy fell. Immediately, George swung the rifle toward the banyan. The real sniper reacted exactly as George expected. He turned toward the sound. Movement. George fired before the sniper could fully reposition. The second body fell. 2 shots. 2 kills. But George had revealed his position. He grabbed his rifle and ran. Machine gun fire erupted seconds later, raking the rocks where he had been positioned moments before. George relocated again, into a drainage ditch, then into a shell crater partially filled with rainwater. He lay submerged up to his chest, rifle held vertically to keep water out of the barrel. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The final sniper would be the most dangerous. He had watched 10 men die. He knew George's habits, and he would not be in the trees. At 09:47, George realized the mistake. Movement at ground level, 60 yards south, slow, deliberate. The sniper was crawling through undergrowth, using ferns and vines for cover, approaching George's last known position. George remained motionless in the water. The angle was wrong. To fire, he would have to expose himself. He waited. Patience had killed 10 men already. At Tantodorki, the sniper reached the rocks. He took up a firing position facing east. His back was exposed. A clear shot. George hesitated. A man who had survived this long would not make a simple mistake. George scanned again and found him. A second soldier behind a fallen tree, 70 yards northwest, covering the first. 2 men. George lowered himself deeper into the water and waited. At 10:13, both soldiers began moving east. They passed George's position, their backs exposed. George rose from the water. He fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both soldiers fell. 11 snipers dead. As George collected his spent cartridges, voices emerged from the tree line. Infantry. At least 6 men. They were moving toward the bodies. George submerged again. The voices grew closer. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater rim and looked directly down at George. George fired from the water. The soldier fell. George rose, fired twice more. More soldiers shouted. George ran. He broke contact and moved toward American lines. At 11:13, he crossed the perimeter. He reported to Captain Morris, 11 snipers killed over 4 days. The groves were cleared. If you want to see how small decisions under extreme pressure shaped outcomes like this channel preserves stories exactly as they unfolded, without embellishment. That afternoon, George cleaned his rifle again. The war was not over. But this hunt was. The fighting around Point Cruz did not stop immediately after the last sniper was killed. Infantry units continued to patrol the groves for days, moving cautiously, expecting resistance that never came. The trees were searched, bodies were recovered where possible, weapons were cataloged, positions were mapped, and then abandoned as the battalion shifted east. For most of the men involved, the operation ended as a set of numbers written into reports. For John George, it did not end at all. In the days that followed, he was not sent back into the jungle. Captain Morris ordered him to rest. The battalion was preparing to move, and the threat that had consumed them for nearly a week was gone. George remained in his tent. He cleaned the Winchester repeatedly, more often than necessary. He stripped it down, wiped mud from the action, dried the barrel, rechecked the scope mounts. He performed the same actions again and again, methodically, as if repetition itself could close something that had been left open. When Morris summoned him to headquarters, George expected a reprimand. He had operated alone. He had engaged without direct authorization. He had drawn enemy fire that destroyed a bunker and exposed battalion positions. Instead, Morris asked a single question. Could George train other men to do what he had done? The Army had not planned for snipers in this theater. There were no formal sniper sections in the table of organization. Rifles with optics were rare. Training was improvised. But the results at Point Cruz could not be ignored. George agreed with one condition. He wanted to keep his Winchester. The request was approved. Within days, George was assigned 14 Springfield rifles, equipped with unertl scopes, left behind by Marine units. He was also given a list of 40 men who had qualified as expert marksmen before deployment. Training began on January 27th, 2 miles east of Henderson Field. The men were good shooters on paper. They had passed qualification ranges. They understood marksmanship fundamentals. None of them had hunted men from concealment. George did not speak much during training. He demonstrated instead. Breathing control, trigger pressure, wind reading, patience. The difference between hitting a target and surviving the shot. He taught them to shoot once and move, to never admire their work, to treat every position as compromised the moment a round was fired. The jungle did not allow perfect firing positions. George taught them to build stability from whatever existed. Rocks, logs, sandbags, roots. Nothing was ideal. Everything was usable. After 3 days, 32 of the 40 men could reliably hit man-sized targets at 300 yards under field conditions. George divided them into 16 two-man teams, shooter and spotter. Roles interchangeable, responsibility shared. The sniper section began operations on February 1st. Their mission was not dramatic. Clear remaining Japanese positions west of the Matanikau River. Eliminate rear guards. Interdict movement. In 1 day, George's section killed 23 Japanese soldiers without a single American casualty. The numbers were conservative. Only confirmed engagements were counted. The Japanese evacuation accelerated. Within 2 weeks, Guadalcanal was effectively secured. George did not celebrate. On February 7th, near the Tanaru River, a Japanese rifleman shot him in the left shoulder. The bullet passed through muscle, missing bone and major arteries. The impact spun George around and knocked him to the ground. A corporal dragged him to cover, while a medic applied a field dressing. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors told him he would recover fully, but not quickly. No combat operations for at least 3 weeks. While George recovered, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. When American forces reached Cape Esperance on February 9th, they found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. Division headquarters took notice. A Bronze Star was recommended. But George's war was not finished. Orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced officers for long-range jungle operations. The assignment was classified. The destination was Burma. George volunteered. By March 1943, he was aboard a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth. George did not know the details of the mission, only that it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of fighting where a man with discipline mattered more than a unit with numbers. In India, George joined a new formation that did not yet have an official name. The men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. Their task was simple in description and brutal in execution. Move hundreds of miles through terrain the enemy believed impassable. Operate without supply lines. Engage and disappear. Create pressure where none was expected. The jungle in Burma was worse than Guadalcanal. Steeper terrain, heavier rainfall, denser vegetation. George modified his equipment. Weight mattered. Every ounce counted. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan with a lighter Weaver scope. He reduced the rifle's weight where possible. During the march toward Myitkyina, George fired his rifle only a handful of times. 3 shots. 3 kills. Most fighting was close. Ambushes at 50 yards or less. The jungle swallowed distance. George learned something during those months. The Winchester Model 70 was an exceptional rifle, perhaps the finest bolt-action sporting rifle ever built. But modern warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles were becoming standard. Massed fire replaced individual precision. There would be fewer moments like Point Cruz. George survived Burma. He was evacuated with the rest of the Marauders in June 1944. The unit was disbanded. George returned to the United States and was assigned to training duties. He taught infantry officers marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught what worked. He taught what failed. He never spoke publicly about Point Cruz. After the war, George was discharged with the rank of lieutenant colonel. 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantry Badge. He returned to civilian life. He studied. He worked. He built a career far from the jungle. The Winchester traveled with him, from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma, and back again. It sat in a case, cleaned, maintained, rarely touched. George understood something that had not been clear to him during the war. The fight did not end when the shooting stopped. Some experiences followed a man home. They did not announce themselves. They did not demand attention. They waited. Years later, George wrote down what had happened. Not for fame, not for recognition, for accuracy. He wanted the details preserved. The distances, the mistakes, the lessons. The book was technical, precise, unemotional. It became a reference. George never returned to Guadalcanal. He did not need to. The place had returned with him. If you want to understand why some moments stay with people long after the war ends, this channel focuses on those moments, not the headlines. John George died in January 2009. He was 90 years old. The Winchester Model 70 that had cleared the Point Cruz groves now rests in a museum display case. Most visitors walk past it without stopping. It looks like any other old rifle. But it is not. It is a reminder that sometimes the deepest scars are not visible. They are carried quietly, and they last a lifetime.